Gotzi also writes that she observed during her ethnographic studies in Bulgaria that women were more likely to.
Oh, baby! Bulgarien mentioned!
Base?
W! Okay, sorry. Was geht ab, YouTube? Wir schauen jetzt The Revolution Needs Woman and Woman Need Revolution von Revolutionary Thought vor 15 Stunden abgeloadet und wir gehen da rein. Ihr lasst jetzt auch ein Like da, so wie ich das jetzt soeben getan habe und schreibt einen Kommentar und drückt den Abo-Knopf und so weiter und so fort. Let's go.
Remember how in 2017, around the time Trump started his first term, there was all this merch, posters, t-shirts, whatever, that said a woman's place is in the revolution. Some of them actually said resistance or whatever, usually superimposed on an image of Leia from Star
LOL.
Wars, but for the purposes of this video, let's go with revolution. I fully agree with that statement. It's unironically true, a woman's place is in the revolution, but liberal feminism, like the variety present at the Women's March, where many of these posters and merch could be seen, is definitely not the way to accomplish that, and is actually antithetical to women's liberation.
Was?
Yes, a woman's place is in the revolution. The revolution needs women, and women need the revolution. But
Women.
if liberal feminism won't get us there,
The revolution needs women.
what will? The answer is socialism. It's almost like this is what the theme of my entire channel
Shush!
is. In this video, we're going to talk about how capitalism hurts women and why it's this way, why liberal feminism doesn't help, how socialism fixes pretty much all of these problems, and why the revolution needs women and women need the revolution.
Oh yeah, baby! Let's go!
Did you know that
Capitalism hurts women, stand da gerade.
misogyny is really convenient to the functioning of class society? Under capitalism, which is a type of class society in which the bourgeois ruling class own the means of production, and if you don't own means of production, you sell your labor power for a wage, women's unpaid domestic labor is a necessary requirement for the reproduction of society. Basically, women do all this domestic labor that isn't really viewed as labor.
So, Digga, so.
And that they obviously don't get compensated for in any way. And this unpaid domestic labor is essentially what keeps society running. It reproduces society. That's why it's called reproductive labor, not just because you're reproducing yourself, but because you're reproducing all of society. This includes cooking, cleaning, child rearing, childbirthing, which in the US you have to pay money to do, providing emotional support, basically all the things the workforce requires to keep coming to work the next day, or the stuff required to create a new generation of workers. A lot of domestic labor could and should be something that is supported by government programs because the entire purpose of a government is to be a centralized administrative body that does stuff for its people and distributes resources according to everyone's abilities and needs, from each according to their ability, for each according to their need, but in a mode of production focused on the
Hört sich gut an, aber
maximization of profits, like capitalism,
Oh.
doing so simply
hört sich nicht gut an.
would not be profitable and therefore not very likely to happen. Like, sure, the government could easily provide everyone with cheap and healthy food and offer subsidized house cleaning services for disabled people and provide free universal childcare at every workplace, for example, but that wouldn't be profitable for private corporations.
That's not happening.
So they probably won't be doing that. And all of that is why women doing the majority of this work for free is very convenient to keeping capitalism going. Because instead of the government paying for all this stuff that could very well be social programs, women just do it for free. Because we think of it as natural, but it's not natural, it's constructed, and we're going to talk about how that happened. Obviously, the solution to that isn't just women stop cooking and cleaning, live in squalor, and order delivery food every day, because that'd be absurd. The answer is socialism, which we'll get to in a little bit. But the reason for women being the ones expected to do unpaid domestic labor actually has to do with the transition from feudalism to capitalism and the primitive accumulation that coincided with that transition. In Caliban and the Witch, Mark
Oh yeah, baby. Wenn euch. Oh yeah. Wenn euch das interessiert, so, gibt ein Video auf meinem Kanal, da lesen wir so eine Rede von Clara Zetkin für die Befreiung der Frau. Und das ist auf jeden Fall sehr interessant, weil das toucht auch so ein bisschen das, so mit der Mode of Production, weißt du, weil früher, wisst ihr, als Frauen noch gesponnen haben oder so, like, wisst ihr, da haben die selber Sachen gemacht. Und dann irgendwann war das aber nicht mehr worth, das zu machen, weil die industrielle Produktion hat die quasi verdrängt. Und ja, mäßig so dies, das, Ananas. Und ja, gibt's ein Video auf meinem Main-Kanal. Ja, weiter geht's.
Marxist feminist
Kurz bisschen Main-Kanal geplagt, muss auch mal sein, Alter.
scholar Silvia Federici argues that this reproductive labor was central to the creation and expansion of capitalism. Federici basically says that Marx's Capital Volume 1 correctly describes how primitive accumulation works, but only really from the viewpoint of the industrial proletariat, which makes the description incomplete. In Capital Volume 1, Marx basically argues that the violent expropriation of land from the European peasantry, their separation from their means of production, forced these peasants to have to sell their labor power for a wage and was a necessary component of the transition to capitalism. That's primitive accumulation. It's basically the process that separated laborers from their means of production to create the conditions for capitalism. But according to Federici, that view of primitive accumulation is incomplete because the rise of capitalism didn't just privatize land. It also privatized and regulated women's labor and bodies. And colonialism, chattel slavery was also a big part of it and allowed European colonizers to acquire the capital needed to make capitalism a thing. Because racism is also convenient for capitalism. All forms of bigotry are. Before we talk more about primitive accumulation and how wage labor became a thing, I wanted to talk about some ways to make doing research like this way easier using the sponsor of today's video, UPDF. When you study revolutionary history and theory,
Sorry. Can't do that now.
you can simply talk to UPDF,
Oh.
download and install UPDF by clicking back to the video. Let's go back to feudalism for a moment.
Okay.
Feudal serfs didn't really work for wages like we do today. They worked their lord's land in exchange for protection, housing, and their own plot of land to farm, but they also had access to common lands like pastures, meadows, lakes, and forests that they used for things like raising livestock, foraging, fishing, and gathering resources like firewood or timber. These were called the commons.
Das hört sich geil an, Alter.
Serfs had usage rights over these commons and effectively managed them with other serfs. So yeah, serfs didn't really have wages until the Black Death. The Black Death, which wiped out a third of the population of Europe, created a massive labor shortage, which made it so that serfs could do additional work for a wage on top of their normal serf duties. And a pretty good wage at that, even for women laborers. Like, I think it says that a laborer could just buy a pig from a day's worth of wages, which,
Was?
I don't know, that sounds like a lot of money to me. I don't.
Ja, Digga, was?
I imagine pigs are expensive. Probably. By the end of the 14th century, serfs were largely replaced by free farmers who would only accept work if they got paid really well, which sounds great and all, but unfortunately, this was a slippery slope to capitalism. Oopsie, because then the powers that be privatized all that common land, so wages went from being additional money for someone who's connected to their own means of production and has access to guaranteed housing and
Also dieses ganze Land, was quasi so gesellschaftlich, gemeinschaftlich genutzt werden konnte, wurde halt privatisiert. So. Damit die Leute nicht mehr von der Natur leben konnten. So und darauf angewiesen sind, eine Bezahlung zu bekommen. Und ja, das hat die Leute dann halt mit der Industrialisierung und so in die Städte getrieben und so weiter und so fort.
land to being something you need to survive and to afford housing or land at all. Yikes. If you've seen my human nature video, in which I talk about how human nature is actually a dialectical struggle of opposites, and that what we consider to be human nature is actually determined in large part by what is incentivized by society, you'll know what I'm about to say. When you incentivize collective responsibility over things, people tend to be a lot nicer to each other, and when you incentivize competition and selfishness, people tend to be more competitive and selfish. What's up with that? Who knew? The commons were really important for fostering a sense of community and solidarity, and were especially important for women since they had less title to land and less social power. So these commons were basically the center of women's social lives, and when they were enclosed on and privatized through violence, this sense of cooperation was totally disrupted. As you'd guess. As Federici argues, once the commons were enclosed, social cohesion broke down, poverty increased, and communities became fragmented and increasingly hostile, which was really bad for women since at the same time their work was becoming devalued and they were becoming increasingly confined to reproductive labor. With the enclosure of the commons, instead of having shared collective responsibility like before, people were now competing against each other for wage labor. So fellow workers were seen as potential threats rather than like people you could organize with against your shared lords so you could improve your living conditions somewhat. And unlike men who could become vagabonds or migrant workers, women didn't really have that option because at around that same time, the ruling class decriminalized sexual violence against proletarian women to function as a pressure release valve for dealing with potentially rebellious men. At the same time, the ruling class decriminalized sexual violence against proletarian women to function as a pressure release valve for dealing with potentially rebellious men. The patterns. This policy co-opted young men who might otherwise rise up against the status quo and gave them access to free sex and women's bodies, non-consensually, of course, to disrupt solidarity between men and women. This normalization of sexual violence against women created a climate of intense misogyny and desensitized the population to violence against women. So by the time the witch hunts happened, people were like, okay, whatever. Bro, the patterns. They keep repeating. With this new economic setup in which workers subsisted on wages and were disconnected from their means of production, productive and reproductive labor were effectively split up and became differentiated based on gender. At this point, reproductive labor came to be viewed exclusively as women's labor. Only production was seen as something that created value, while reproductive labor started to be seen as totally valueless and stopped being considered labor at all. And even if women wanted to work outside the home, they were largely excluded from many waged forms of labor and earned meager wages compared to the average male wage, which thrust a lot of proletarian women into poverty. The devaluation of reproductive labor also devalued its product, which is labor power. So you remember those good wages that serfs had after the Black Death?
Was geht ab? Schön, dass du da bist.
Yeah, so the ruling class didn't like the working class having too good of material conditions and made it all go bye-bye by normalizing violence against women, gendering labor, excluding women from wage labor in public life, expropriating a bunch of land, reducing wages for everyone and especially women, and making it very, very difficult for women to sustain themselves on their own. And everyone's wages went down. Meanwhile, women who didn't stick to the idealized model of performing reproductive labor in the context of a heterosexual monogamous family unit headed by a man literally had their property expropriated from them and had violence inflicted against them in the form of witch hunts, legal and social attacks, and regulation of their sexuality and family life. These legal attacks and witch hunts targeted midwives, healers, prostitutes, childless women, widows who owned property,
Digga, imagine, also, like, oder?
Basically any woman who was inconvenient to the political goal of forcing women into doing unpaid reproductive labor in a male-headed household. With the rise of mercantilism, the European ruling class started focusing on creating as large of a workforce in their nations as possible and took away women's traditional control over contraception, abortion, and fertility in an attempt to support that goal. What a bunch of freaks. Also, the patterns! This redefinition of a woman's role in society happened over a long time, starting with the enclosure of the commons in the 15th century and peaking in the 19th century with the creation of the full-time housewife role. And there were a lot of witch hunts in between, which were utilized as a way of eliminating undesirable behavior in women. Over all that time, women doing reproductive labor became framed as something totally natural and, like, not even a form of labor anyway, because, like, women should give birth and cook and clean and raise children. Basically, the birth of capitalism
Scheiß Frauen, Alter.
restructured gender relations through violence, and we're still living with the consequences of that today.
Liberal feminism won't help. Let's go.
So if capitalism creates these conditions, what's the solution? Well, certainly not liberalism or its liberal feminist offshoot. Liberalism is a right-wing capitalist ideology. According to Marxist scholar Domenico Lacerdo, the rise of liberalism coincided with the spread of racial chattel slavery because they are the product of a twin birth. They're like inseparable, buddy. Like liberalism was literally never meant to be liberatory for anyone except property owning white men. John Locke, the father of liberalism, was literally for the violent expropriation of indigenous lands and was a shareholder in the Royal African Company, all of which he justified in his writings. Locke even demanded that anyone who made an attempt on another person's life or property be punished with enslavement. This guy loved slavery. He also thought the enclosure of the commons was dope as hell and justified it with his labor theory of property. He thought owning stuff in common sucked, actually, which is why he was for the expropriation of indigenous lands.
Mann, Digga, was ein Hurensohn.
Because he wanted property to only be a private thing. No owning stuff in common. In liberalism
Was ein Dreck.
and counter history, Lacerda goes over a ton of examples of liberal scholars being like, I love private property, and I think poor people are awful, and we need to make it harder for people to be poor and make workhouses into prisons, which is a real thing that'll.
What? In this philosophy, which began to take shape with Malthus, de Tocqueville likewise joined. It is obvious that we must make assistance unpleasant. We must separate families, make the workhouse a prison, and render our charity repugnant. Make the workhouse a prison, Alter. Haben die auf jeden Fall hinbekommen, ohne Scheiß.
Alexis de Tocqueville said.
Like, too real for me in real life, Alter.
And poor children should start working at the age of 3, a real thing John Locke said.
Hä? Achso. This detailed regulation obviously also included religious indoctrination. In Locke's view, for poor children to start work from the age of 3 was a beneficial measure. Alter. Not only economically, but also morally. Another advantage of bringing poor children to a working school is that by this means they may be obliged to come constantly to church every Sunday along with the schoolmasters or dames, whereby they may be brought into some sense of religion. In his turn, Mandeville demanded that Sunday attendance of church become a duty for the poor and illiterate. Ah. Chillig.
Locke said, and some people need to be poor and ignorant so that us property owners can have nice things, which are real things that Townsend and Mandeville said. I mean, not
Cool.
Not word for word, I'm paraphrasing.
Ab 3, Digga, ab 3 sollten arme Kinder arbeiten gehen. Mit 3 Jahren, Bruder.
But they
I mine for the yearns. Ja, I mine for the yearns too, Alter.
endorsed that sort of thing. Like, it's kind of funny when people say that socialism sounds good on paper but never works in reality, which is not true, as we'll find out soon. But liberalism doesn't even sound good on paper or in theory or whatever.
Hey, make the workhouse a prison hört sich doch geil an, Alter, ja? So W.
It sounds like a bunch of dudes who wanted to have access to nice things at the expense of everyone else and then justified it through racism and misogyny, because that's what liberalism is. It's not whatever Hamilton shows you or whatever history textbooks teach you in the US. The structure of liberal democracies is rooted in this wacky ideology, and liberal democracies like the US are also by design and by definition dictatorships of the bourgeoisie, where the bourgeoisie are in charge of how society is structured because they own all the means of production and do all they can to maintain that power, which sometimes includes siding with fascists. As Marxist historian Michael Parenti said in one of his lectures,
oh, rest in power, Digga.
It is the heart of US policy to use fascism to preserve capitalism while claiming to be saving democracy from communism. And this is a feature and not a bug of liberal democracy. They will literally use fascism to keep capitalism going. Liberalism cannot possibly be a liberatory ideology.
Boah, Digga, ich schwör auf alles, ne? Ich bin so müde, Digga. Ich muss mir jetzt mein Monster holen, obwohl wir erst 11 Uhr haben. Aber ich bin wirklich, also, Digga, wirklich. Like, ich weiß nicht, ob das, also, wahrscheinlich liegt das daran, dass ich seit 8 Uhr wach bin. Und auch irgendwie daran, dass ich Pollenallergie habe und jetzt auf Antiallergikum bin und so. Aber, Digga. Oh, ich bin, also, Bruder, wirklich, ich fühle mich hier gerade wie so, erste Stunde im Unterricht, Bruder, und ich sitze hier einfach nur so und bin so halb anwesend. Wisst ihr, wie ich meine so? Deswegen, ich gehe mir jetzt ganz kurz mein Monster holen, Alter. Sacred Red Sun, schön, dass du da bist. Und, ja. Ja. Bis gleich.
Because liberation for everyone was never its purpose. Its purpose is to make sure that people who own private property have the most power and say over how society runs and to justify structuring society in that way. Like, the US has been a liberal democracy since its inception, so it's had exactly 250 years to get it together, and yet many US states don't even provide guaranteed abortion access. There's still a wage differential between men and women. There's no guaranteed federal...
Wap. Here we go. Let's go. Dafür kann man mal ein Like da lassen, oder? Yes.
parental leave, giving
Nom nom nom.
Birth costs money, and there's no guaranteed universal childcare or anything like that. And no universal healthcare. One of the few countries in the world without it. You know that phrase, if he wanted to, he would? Yeah. The he in this case is the US, but I feel like that phrase just fits really well here. Like, yes, obviously women have it better in the capitalist US now than they did 200 years ago, in large part due to organizing efforts by feminists, including some liberal ones even. But there's been so many setbacks to women's rights in recent years that have basically shown us the limitations of liberal feminism. For example, liberal feminism aims to enact feminist goals in the context of a liberal democracy, which means fighting only for concessions under capitalism rather than fighting to dismantle capitalism itself. It's also literally rooted in the suffragette
Dickes F.
movement, in which white women were like, let's fight to get the vote. Oh, black people want the vote too. Well, I am certainly not fighting for that. Which is like
Dickes F.
bonkers, right? Like basically totally ignoring worker solidarity and the fact that all these systems of oppression have the same root cause, which is capitalism. Like dismantling capitalism is a necessary
Na, Digga, also, like, ich kämpfe lieber für niemandes Rechte, als mit den rassistischen weißen Frauen für ihre Rechte zu kämpfen, weißt du, so ein Ding ist das.
condition for the dismantling of patriarchy and white supremacy and ableism and all of that other stuff. Liberal feminism also views the primary contradiction as being between men and women rather than between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and aims to get more women into positions of power rather than challenging the capitalist system that produces misogyny. Liberalism in general just reduces systemic oppression to a matter of identity and representation and completely ignores the economic system that generates that oppression and benefits from it and profits from it. Like the liberal assumption is that putting women into positions of power within a fundamentally oppressive system like capitalism will make it less oppressive, but it won't.
Nein.
Women CEO is still a CEO who will exploit her workers and extract value from their labor. A woman politician in the US will tend to, by default, support imperialist intervention in global South countries. A woman IOF soldier is still a war criminal. Being a woman doesn't magically make someone incapable of exploiting others or of committing war crimes, and putting more women in positions of power doesn't address the root cause of
Ja, brüll.
Capitalism. Liberal feminism also tends to completely ignore the struggles of women in the global South, and just like the global South in general, because it's a pro-imperialist ideology that sees marginalized people in the global South as victims of their own nations rather than as victims of Western imperialism. I mean, there's literally liberal feminists out there right now who think that miniskirts are indicative of freedom and that hijabs are inherently repressive, and then end up believing absurd things like that the US bombing a school full of girls is a gateway to freedom for Iranian women. No.
Stimmt doch auch, oder?
Oh. Bombing a country
Ist doch freiheitlich-demokratischer präventiver Angriff auf eine Schule, ist doch gut. Hab ich gehört.
And killing its leaders and literal civilians and school children is not a gateway to freedom for any
Was? Nicht? Glaube ich nicht, Digga, glaube ich nicht.
Country, and will probably make it more repressive rather than more free. Going to war with Iran is a horrible idea and very bad for the Iranian people, including women, and also like not good for the US unless you enjoy paying like $7 for a gallon of gas. But it's obviously way worse for people on the ground in Iran. But anyway, no to war with Iran, no to war with Venezuela, lift the blockade on Cuba. Anyway, liberal feminism is not gonna help women. I mean, it can help women somewhat, but it's just not enough. You need a socialist economic base to truly liberate women.
Yeah, baby! Socialist economic base? W.
At this point, the only viable alternative to capitalism is socialism.
Yeah, baby girl, let's go.
There's no secret third option. Social democracies still allow for the exploitation of the global South. So they're still functionally capitalist, just a nicer form of capitalism for the people at home, but still exploitative and violent towards the global South. Which, like, no one is free until everyone's free. Your comforts shouldn't depend on other people being exploited. Women's liberation is part of socialism's program. My boy Friedrich Engels literally has a whole text about how socialism is a necessary condition for women's liberation called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, and it's a banger. Like, liberalism started with a whole bunch of boring dudes justifying why they're the chads and deserve to own property while everyone else is a bunch of virgins and can suffer. But Marx and Engels were like, hey, what if women weren't economically dependent
Ja, Mann. Slay, Digga. W.
on men? And what if workers had a say in how society runs and owned their own workplaces? Then we could stop being so alienated.
Slay.
Wouldn't that be nice? So yeah, socialism's better on paper and in real life. Women have also played an important role in basically every revolution. The February Revolution of 1917, which ousted the Tsardom, leading to the installation of a new provisional government and giving women the right to vote, was started by striking women textile workers. March 8th, International Working Women's Day, was first made official in the Socialist Soviet Union in 1918
Was?
and was originally
Nein, das glaube ich ja jetzt nicht.
a holiday celebrating the contribution of
Glaube ich jetzt nicht.
working women to revolutionary causes and honoring the role of women in the Russian Revolution. In socialist Cuba, women started what is known as the revolution within the revolution and have been a major force
Tschüss.
in enacting
Revolution-Maxing, Alter. Revolution.
change in Cuba, even like completely overhauling how Cubans view healthcare because of their unique perspective as women. Socialists have always recognized the importance of women's contributions to the revolutionary cause. When you look at any successful socialist revolution, women were heavily involved in the revolution itself and in the shaping of revolutionary policies. And nearly every time socialists have gotten into power, women's rights were greatly expanded pretty much immediately. Although there's some weird anomalies like Romania, where they outlawed abortion, which was
Huh?
a really bad idea. You shouldn't do that. As ethnographer Kristen Godsey writes on why women have been
Huh?
under socialism, women's
Geiles Buch.
emancipation was a major part of the ideology of all Eastern European state socialist nations. Although important differences existed between countries and none achieved full equality in practice, these nations did expend vast resources to invest in women's education and training and to promote them in professions previously dominated by men. Understanding the demands of reproductive biology, they also attempted to socialize domestic work and childcare by building a network of public creches, kindergartens, laundries, and cafeterias. Extended job-protected maternity leaves and child benefits allowed women to find at least a modicum of work-family balance. Moreover, 20th century state socialism did improve the material conditions of millions of women's lives. Maternal and infant mortality declined, life expectancy increased, and illiteracy all but disappeared. Godsey also writes that she observed during her ethnographic studies in Bulgaria that women were more likely to
Oh, baby! Bulgarien mentioned! W! Okay, sorry. Sorry. Wollte nicht übertreiben.
Godsey also writes that she observed during her ethnographic studies in Bulgaria that women were
Yeah!
more likely to express nostalgia for the state socialist past because the transition to liberal democracy led to a loss of many of the aforementioned benefits that women had under socialism.
Was? Frauen in Bulgarien sagen auch, Sozialismus war gut? Damn, krass.
Like subsidized childcare provided at pretty much every workplace and university. Privatization, like the enclosure of the commons, disproportionately impacted women and robbed them of the generous social safety nets that they had under socialism. It also made it a lot harder for women to get jobs like immediately after capitalist shock therapy because with rising unemployment, companies prioritized hiring men because with capitalism, the patriarchy was brought back full force. Refer back to the enclosure of the commons section. Basically, all the same stuff happened to women with capitalist shock therapy in Eastern Europe. The patterns. I mean, my mom apparently had like 3 years of maternity leave after giving birth to me. Thank you, Soviet Union, but I guess not every post-socialist country
Thank you, Soviet Union, or...
kept that safety net, which sucks. And I'm not even trying to claim that every socialist country immediately achieved full gender equality, but they definitely improved women's material conditions overall in like a really big way. And if you want more specific
In a huge way.
critiques of socialist policies as they
Haben wir schon gesehen? Geiles Video.
pertain to women, go watch my video about women in the USSR. And if you want more positive examples of what
Haben wir auch gesehen? Auch geiles Video. Bulgarien wird auch gemenschent, so.
socialist countries have done for women, go watch my video about how socialism helps women. But yeah, instead of being like, Yes, girl boss, you have bodily autonomy. I mean, not really, but it is your right to choose if you want to shave your armpits or not, like liberal feminism. Socialist nations tend to actually establish materially beneficial things like subsidized childcare, public laundries, cafeterias, public transit, free after school programs for kids, free higher education, universal or at least near universal healthcare, and literally all of that is good for women and eases their burden when it comes to doing reproductive labor, because a lot of that burden is put on the state instead. So women don't end up in a situation where they're like, oh no, I can't afford childcare or housing, because guess what? Those are guaranteed. And all of that makes women no longer have to be financially dependent on men. So women can leave a bad relationship rather than being trapped in it by financial need, which is literally life-saving in some cases. One of my childhood internet friends who I
yeah,
was
baby.
besties with like 20 years ago on
Oh shit, Digga, noch 2 Minuten und ich muss hardcore pinkeln, Alter. Schaffen wir das?
online
Wir schaffen das. Ich muss schon seit 6 Minuten oder so pinkeln, Digga. Die 2 Minuten schaffen wir auch noch.
committed suicide a few years ago.
Oh shit.
And I just learned recently that her husband
Oh fuck.
is now in prison on CSA and CSAM charges. She's from a town where the per capita salary is about 20,000. She was raising 3 kids and she was about to start grad school, so I doubt she had the money required to leave this guy. And she's not here anymore because she was financially reliant on a man who was probably abusing her children and her and felt like she had no way out except for just not being here anymore.
Oh.
Which is harrowing and incredibly sad. Like, how many women are lost to capitalism like this? Certainly way too many. If there was actually a safety net and people were guaranteed access to necessities like housing, healthcare, food, water, education, women could actually leave abusive men and not have to risk poverty or homelessness to do so. If necessities were guaranteed, women wouldn't have to marry for money or stay in bad relationships for financial reasons, and personal relationships wouldn't function like a market. In a socialist system, we could work towards actually dismantling all of this patriarchal conditioning, like what Cuba's been doing as a result of its revolution within a revolution, and make existing as a woman just way easier. In every way. A better
Das wäre geil, Alter.
world is possible. We just have to get organized and build it. And women are instrumental in building that better world. So everyone please become a whole lot more socialist right now, because the revolution needs women and women need revolution.
So!
Thanks for watching. This video was made possible by
Alter, W-Video. Oh nein, jetzt habe ich irgendwas auf dem... Ne, alles gut. Thank you so much again for this nice video. Okay, ey, geiler Kommentar geschrieben. Ich muss hardcore pinkeln, also schreibt ihr mir jetzt auch einen Kommentar. X werdet Frauen. Like das Video, drückt den Abo-Knopf, bemüht meine Glocken, checkt mein Stream aus. Ich bin in der Regel jeden Tag live und habt noch einen schönen Tag. Haut rein. Ciao!